Hey folks, welcome to the 30 Days to Learn Adobe After Effects course. My name is Vincent Nguyen, and today in this lesson we're going to be discussing about the type tools within Adobe After Effects. So as some of you may have already noticed, the type tool is a little icon up here with the T on it, and you can use this tool to type stuff. Now if you click and hold on the icon here, you can select either the horizontal type tool, which allows you to type horizontally, or the vertical type tool. But most of the time the horizontal type tool will work best. So I'm going to select it. And then of course you can click onto your composition window here and type in whatever you want. Type some text. And that's a really nice, easy way to create some text. I like to go to Layer, New, Text. I find it's a lot easier for me. And I can type whatever I want here. Now, in addition to that, some of the panels that will help you is the characters panel right here. Now, if you don't see the characters panel, go to Window and make sure that the characters panel is checked here. You also may want to enable the Align panel, which will be very useful for you, as well as the Paragraphs panel right here. So I have all three panels selected right here, and I'll just walk you through some of the basic stuff here. So over here in the characters panel, you can change your font here, you can change the font style, the font size, all the tracking, kerning, all that stuff is all right here. And this is just your standard, characters panel that you will see a lot in Photoshop, Microsoft Word. You'll see a lot of these. These are very, very common parameters here. It's like some spacing between the top and bottom lines, the tracking here, and the stroke here. But so these are all just some very basic parameters that you'll see in a lot of text editors as well. So, nothing too much to explain here. It's all very self-explanatory. And if you hover over the parameter here, you can see what it does here. For example, set the stroke width. Now on the bottom here, if you have the paragraphs panel checked, you also have some basic paragraph options, which is the left align, center align, right align, and justified. You also have some indentions and additional options here. These are very straightforward as well. I don't want to spend too much time talking about them. You also have the align panel, which will easily allow you to center stuff really quickly. So if I go to Layer, New, Text, and type in our text, we can center it vertically and horizontally very easily. So this is a really nice handy panel to have open when working with text. But enough about those basic stuff. I want to get into the real fun stuff, which are the animators for text, such as the tracking and stuff like that. So when you create a new text layer here, let me just delete this current one here and turn this one on, our fun text here. Now, when you have a text layer, you have a lot of additional options that are kind of hidden to you until you toggle them down. So I'm going to make some room, and I'm going to change the zoom to fit, and I want to explore some of the animators with you in text, and these are really, really fun, and these are where you can get pretty fancy and create some pretty nice text animations here. So we have our text layer right here. I'm going to toggle down the options. You'll see that we have tons and tons of options here. First, you'll see text, transform, and material options. We'll focus on text for this lesson. And you have first the source text, which is pretty much whatever the source is in the text right here. In our case, the source text right now is fun text. But let's not focus on that right now. Let's go ahead and focus on the animate button right here. So right here, the play button, you can select a whole bunch of animators here. And think of animators as somewhat as effectors within Cinema 4D. These are pretty much things that you can animate your text with. So aside from position, rotation, opacity, we have additional options that we can animate. For example, we have the character offset here. If we click on it, it's going to create a new animator, which is kind of the first effector. And then we have a range selector, which is it's going to select the range that the animator is going to affect, as well as additional options here. So right here we have the character offset for an example. And if we change it, you can see that it kind of screws up our text here, and it just kind of offsets the characters of our text. And that's pretty cool. And when you do that, it's going to affect the whole text right here. But if you go into the range selector here, we can actually select the range in which the animator is going to affect our text. So right now, the starting point is 0% to 100. So that means that it's going to affect all 100%. But if we change the start to 50%, and then our end to 100%, that means that the whole animator is only going to affect 50% of our text here. So as you can see, when we change the character offset, it only affects half of the text layer because only the 50% of range is selected here. And of course, you can play around with all this. You can also play around with offset, which is going to offset the range here. And keep in mind that these are all keyframeable because we have the stopwatch icon here. That means we can actually keyframe and animate all these range selectors. So if you combine all these range selectors, you can create some pretty interesting animations here. Now on the bottom we have the advanced tabs, which will depend on what kind of animator you have. But these are pretty straightforward as well, and I'll let you play around with this. So these text animations are kind of the fun stuff within After Effects, and we're really starting to get into more of the fun stuff rather than the boring concept basic stuff. So I'm gonna try not to bore you anymore with all these basic stuff, but we kind of need to get the basics out of the way first. But we're kind of getting close to the end of all the boring stuff, and we're slowly getting our way into the more fun stuff, such as the text animators. And of course, you have the character alignment right here, which will differ from animator to animator. But again, these are all just straightforward, and these are pretty much options for the animator that we have here. So I'm going to delete this animator, and let's just try something else. Let's go ahead and try the blur animator here. Again, it's going to create a new animator and a new selector, range selector, and then we can play around with the blur. And then of course we can play around with the offset as well. So that's a pretty cool, neat thing to do. But let's go ahead and build something that's actually a little more practical than just messing around with these kind of things. So I'm going to delete this animator, and I'm going to start fresh here. So we just have a plain text here. And let's go ahead and create a basic text animation using just the animators themselves. So I'm going to go to the animate button, and then we can go into the tracking. And again, that's going to create an animator 1, which is the kind of controller, and then we have our tracking amount. Now, notice here we have an add button next to our animator 1. You can actually add multiple parameters into one animator. So for an example, I have the tracking amount, that's one parameter that I can animate here. We can also add, a blur property, and that's going to add the blur into our animator 1. So now our animator 1 controls not only our tracking but also our blur, and then we can also add additional properties as well, but I think you get the point. Now selectors are a little bit different. Selectors are kind of like range selectors, except they're a little bit more specific. So for an example, we have the range selector right here, which is the same thing as our range selector number 1 here. You saw the addition of selecting a wiggly selector, which kind of wiggles around your selection. So it's not very constant. It's not really going to stay the same. It's going to be wiggling around your range. So it's kind of like adding evolution or adding randomness to your range. So, and you can play around with that later. And then we also have the expression, which is a little bit more complicated, which we'll talk about a little bit later in future lessons. But these are selectors, and these are kind of the same thing as these selectors here. And properties are parameters that you can add to our animator, which will affect our text layer right here. So enough with that. Let's go ahead and delete our blur, and you'll see why in a second. So we have our animator 1, and we have our tracking amount here. So let's hit a keyframe for the tracking amount, and we'll move forward about 4 seconds long, and we'll change the tracking amount to 9. And what the tracking amount does is it changes the tracking in between each individual letter here. So you can see that we have our nice text, and it's just going to spread out over time. And it's just going to give us a fun little nice movement here. We can even double this thing up to maybe 18 or so, just so we have some nice movement for our text. And you always want your text to be moving. You don't want your text to be staying the same, or else it's going to look very, very boring. So that's pretty cool. So now I want to add a blur property to this text. So we can either add it to our animator 1, or we can create a whole new animator. And I'm going to create a whole new animator. So I'm going to go to animate and hit blur. And that's going to create a second animator just for our blur. And you'll see why I did that in a second. So if we increase the blur amount here, you can see that it just blurs out the text. And then we can go into the range selector and offset this. So I'm going to start at the beginning here. I'm going to hit a keyframe stopwatch for the offset. I'll move halfway in, and I'll change the offset from 0% to 100%. So that way we have our nice tracking, and we have our nice blur animation here. I'm just going to hit RAM preview for that. And as you can see, we have this really nice, cool, and smooth animation. So why did I create a brand new animator just for the blur? Well, because if I add the blur onto the animator 1, that means our animator 1 is going to control the blur and the tracking amount. And I want to separate those two for, easier navigation. And maybe I don't want the range selector to affect the blur, because in this case, we used the range selector for our blur, but we didn't use it for the tracking amount. And I don't want to get those two mixed up. I don't want to get those two, interfering with each other. So I just created a brand new animator to control the range selector as well as blur separately, so we have more fine control. Of course, you have the addition to add a second selector for the blur, but that's just more complicated, and I just wanted to create two separate animators for two separate animation properties. So we can click on this animator 1, press enter, and we can rename this tracking animator, and then we can call animator 2 blur animator. And that's just going to give us, more organization for our workflow. And of course, you can easy ease these keyframes. Right click, go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease, or hit F9. And that's just going to ease things in a little bit, make them a little bit more smoother. Just like that. So just like that, we created a really basic animation just using the animators within text. They're a lot of fun to play around with. You can do a lot of things with them. They can be very, very powerful, and you can create some pretty interesting things if you just play around with all these values right here, all these parameters. And this is the part of After Effects where you just really need to experiment, play around, and you can create some pretty cool things. So that's pretty much it for the type tools and animators for the After Effects. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking about mask and shapes, the difference between them, as well as feathering and stuff like that. So definitely look out for that. If you guys have any further questions, don't hesitate to leave me a comment in the forums. I'll get to them as soon as I can. Once again, guys, my name is Vincent Nguyen, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Bye, guys.